Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a epic poem, a book that I finished listening to last week called The Song of Roland. This is an audiobook that I listened to, so again, I don't have a physical book to hold up and show you, but there's lots of different editions and translations of this work because it has been out for a while. This is written, as I said, in the 12th century. I think 1115 is kind of the date that's typically given, and it is a fascinating work. It is very significant from a literary perspective and a history of literature. It introduces some characters and some themes and genres that will become very prominent, not only in French literature, but in Western literature as a whole. And it's just an interesting story in its own right. So there are, like I said, lots of different editions out there. The version that I was able to listen to, which was just available through Hoopla, the library app, was a translation by D.D.R. Owens, who was a professor of French literature at St. Andrews University. So it was his translation being performed by like a cast of actors with some sound effects and things mixed in. So it wasn't quite an audio drama, properly speaking, but it was more than just a narrated audiobook. So I'll give some thoughts on that production piece and some thoughts on the translation piece. But before I do that, let me just talk about sort of the book itself. So that's kind of the flow. I'll just talk about the poem itself, its significance, what it covers, what stood out to me about it, and then I'll say a few words briefly at the end about the particular translation of D.D.R. Owens and the production that I listened to, kind of the audio drama of it. So what is this poem about? Well, it is a French epic poem that is pretty widely regarded as the earliest work of French literature. So it's very important from that standpoint on its own. Even if it wasn't really an interesting book, it'd be very important because it's sort of the fountainhead of the rest of French literature. Written in the 12th century, so this is a time where, the language of the Western Empire, Latin, has been developing and evolving into what we think of as the Romance languages. So you actually begin to see, not just in France, but in Italy and other places, the emergence of native literature as people have been speaking in these languages and they've been taking shape and evolving and developing. But now you're getting written works which are often celebrating kind of regional, national, cultural, ethnic heroes in these different places throughout Western Europe. So the ascendancy of Latin is still very much prominent. I mean, it's the language of the educated. It's the lingua franca of the Western and educated world. It's the language of the church. So there's a clear kind of primacy there. But you're beginning to get some of these works in French and Italian and Spanish and so forth that are going to lead to the ascendancy of those languages later on. It's kind of its own story. But the Song of Roland is an epic poem that's an important part of that story for the development of the French language and of French literature in general. So it is the first and the most well-known and probably the greatest of a genre of French literature, which is, I do not speak French at all, and I'm intimidated pronouncing things in French, so I'm just going to apologize to anyone who does know French, but the chanson de guettes, I think is I think that's something like it. Anyways, what it means is the songs of deeds. So it's this kind of genre of French literature which focuses on these kind of knightly characters and their adventures and deeds and so forth, and typically centered around the court of Charlemagne. So for English speakers, we may have a kind of idea about the role of King Arthur in terms of British literature. He was a historical figure and he was important, but his importance gets kind of grown and expanded and developed over time in British literature, English-speaking literature. He takes on a kind of mythic quality. The Knights of the Round Table, all become very important. Well, something like that happens with Charlemagne in France as well, and he becomes a kind of paradigmatic Christian prince or king, and he's the kind of paradigmatic knight, the paradigmatic king, the paradigmatic Christian man in different ways. And so he plays a significance in French imagination, French culture, French literature that is even greater than his historical significance, which is significant in its own right, of course, right? So this poem is centering on Charlemagne and the adventures of his knights, specifically a knight named Roland. Now, there is a historical basis to this epic poem. It's an epic poem, about 4,000 lines, so it's not as long as some. I think D.D.R.'s D.D.R. Owen's translation is like 160 pages. Dorothy Sayers, I'll say more about her translation later. If you get that from like Penguin, that's like 200 pages, but part of that's notes. So it's not the longest poem. It's not as long as the Iliad or the Aeneid or something like that. But it's a good sized epic poem, and it's based on a historical battle that took place August 15th, 778. Charlemagne would have been, I think, 38 years old at that point in time, and he was fighting in different places, the Saxons and all these things, but he was also engaged in wars in Spain. At this point, you've got to remember, Spain had been conquered, the Spanish Peninsula had been conquered by Islamic invaders. Islam emerges in the 7th century, and this is taking place in the 8th century, so Islam is kind of swept across what we think of as the Middle East, North Africa, and up into the Spanish Peninsula. And so there's these conflicts taking place between Christian Europe, Western Christian Europe, specifically Charlemagne and the Franks, and then the Islamic Empire to the south, which of course is not a monolithic force, right? There's different groups and all of that going on there. And so in the course of these wars, there was an instance where Charlemagne is moving some of his men. They get trapped in the Pyrenees, in this pass, and end up getting slaughtered. So that's the historical event. And there are several characters that will show up in the poem who were there at that battle, did die in the battle, and so on and so forth. Historically speaking, that was not a really significant moment from a military perspective, from a cultural perspective. It was not this big thing. And importantly, it was actually the Christian Basques, who were, in Spain, who had called on Charlemagne to help them, who ended up betraying him. And so it's this kind of tangled history. But one of the things that comes out in the poem is it's a very stark contrast between kind of Christian knights and Muslim invaders. That's not actually the historical basis of this. It was actually more just geopolitical kind of rumblings back and forth. But that historical event and the death of this French nobleman named Roland apparently kind of gave rise to this rich folklore and mythology, because over the next couple hundred years after that battle, you see that there's all these different stories that are emerging about Roland and the other knights who were there with Charlemagne. And so by the time that the Song of Roland, this poem, is actually written down and recorded, it's sort of giving voice to this rich mythology that is developed. Again, much like King Arthur. There's a historical King Arthur, but a lot of the Arthurian legends and things are going way beyond the history to really draw out his significance in kind of as a paradigmatic figure for British culture. Same thing's happening with Charlemagne and his knights, Roland being an example of that. So the poem itself is really picking up those threads and doing it on a kind of grand epic scale. So this is a war poem that's taking place as Charlemagne and the Saracens, the Muslims, are butting heads. And at the heart of this, you have Charlemagne is in Spain with his massive forces. The Muslim king is trying to figure out how to get rid of Charlemagne, and he comes up with this idea of sort of trickery and deceit. And Charlemagne isn't sure that he believes kind of the offer that's being made. They say, oh, we'll be converted as Christians and we'll give you all these gold and donkeys and things and camels and whatever. And Charlemagne's not sure he believes it, but he says, I'm going to send one of my knights to sort of talk to these guys and see what's going on. And so he's there with his council of 12 knights, and Ganelon is one of the knights there, who is actually the stepfather to Roland, who will become the main character of the story. And Ganelon ends up getting sent down to be like the emissary. No one really wants this job, and Charlemagne's not sure that he wants to send some of his best knights, but Ganelon's name gets recommended by Roland, and apparently they've had some sort of falling out. We aren't really told in the poem what the nature of that was, but Ganelon is very jealous of his stepson. He feels he was slighted in some way. And so when Roland recommends him to go down, he sort of sees that as this final betrayal, this public shame, and it's evidence that it's just a plot to get rid of him. And so as he's going down into the Saracen king, he basically says to himself, I'm going to show them all, and I'm going to plot with the Saracens to betray. He's not really interested in betraying Charlemagne per se. He's really interested in betraying Roland and seeing him die. So he's kind of plotting the death of his son-in-law. And so it unfolds from there. These emissaries go back and forth. Charlemagne does end up, because Ganelon comes back and says, yeah, they're really serious, they're going to do this. And so Charlemagne ends up moving the force of his men back into France, and Roland has the rear guard. So he's at the back of the train, moving his men through, and as they're going through the pass, the Saracens spring their trap, and they kind of fall on Roland. They've got these overwhelming forces, and there's this big battle that ensues. So the poem, it kind of moves back and forth between two kinds of tension or two kinds of action. On the one hand, there's the interpersonal tension of these different characters, and it is interesting because these are not stock characters. I think I was reading some reviewers, and they seem to they picked up on there's this very strong kind of good and evil, right and wrong, black and white, contrast there. This is a medieval poem, right? It's from 1115, early 12th century, and so and it's written from a Western Christian perspective. So they're very much like Christians are obviously, the noble ones, and the Muslims here are these pagans, and so there's a very strong contrast there that is not the way that modern people would probably frame things, and so people assume, okay, they're just dealing with kind of stock characters. But if you actually look at the characters as they're presented and the interactions they have, it's much more finely textured than that. And the relationship, not just between Charlemagne and his knights, but between the knights themselves, is really fascinating. So I've already talked about Ganelon and Roland, who were bound together as family, and yet the tension between them is what kind of drives the story forward. And yet even there, it's not just a simple, depiction of Ganelon as this traitor and Roland as this noble knight, because both of them have their virtues and both of them have their vices. Ganelon is the traitor, but at the end of the story, his part becomes known and he is tried, but he actually shows himself to be very brave, and he kind of argues, this is why I was doing this and why it was not this ignoble deed. So he's a kind of a conflicted character there. Roland, who is this great brave knight, his men love him, he's heroic and he's brave and all these things, but he's also rash, he's also proud. In fact, when the Saracens are first kind of coming up on them, they see them approaching, and Roland knows that if he blows his horn, Charlemagne is still close enough with the main army that they could hear them and come back, and they could fight these guys and they could win. And he has his friend, his companion Oliver, who advises him to do that very thing. He says, blow the horn. We can see they've got way more men than us. We're not going to win this fight, but if we blow the horn, Charlemagne will come and we can fight them together. And Roland says, oh, that would compromise our glory and our honor. We would be disgraced if we did that. So we need to just sort of fight to the death. And so they fight and they do all these things, and then their forces are whittled down to this small group, and Roland says, oh, maybe we should blow the horn. And Oliver says, well, you can't do it now. Now it would be cowardly, right? And he's sort of an I told you so kind of moment. And there's this character, the Archbishop Turpin, who comes in and says, look, we're going to die anyways. They're all over us, but blow the horn and Charlemagne will be able to come and avenge us and give us a Christian burial. And so that's what happened. Roland finally does blow the horn. They fight to the death, and we get to see their death scenes heroically, and then Charlemagne comes, wipes out the Saracens, drives them off, judges Ganelon. That's the end of the poem. So that's kind of the unfolding of the story. So on the one hand, you have this really interesting back and forth between these characters, and they're presented as more 3D characters. And so there's a whole layer to the poem that I think is really interesting. And this is one of the things I would kind of draw out as a value of the poem, especially to read with young people, to just sort of put these characters out there and say, who's admirable and why, and who's not. How do you weight someone like a Roland, who's very brave and charismatic and ambitious, but he's also kind of proud and rash, and his decisions end up costing the lives of many men? How do you think about someone like Oliver, who's clearly brave, but he's a bit more pragmatic as well? And and there can be tension between them. So there's just a lot there to kind of unpack. So that's one layer of the poem, is that it's drawing these characters into view and giving us something to interact with. Another layer is this is a heroic, epic poem, and so there's long descriptions of the battles that take place, and primarily it's sort of the knights, the Christian knights and the Saracen knights who were clashing. And again, here it's interesting because there is a very strong like Christian versus Muslim theme here, which again reflects not only the battle historically, but think about the time period this is being written in. It's right in the middle of the Crusades. So this is something that's going on culturally, and I think the Song of Roland as an epic poem is tapping into that. And so there is this very strong contrast, and yet it portrays some of these Muslim knights as being brave and noble men in their own right. So it's not a kind of just, the noble Christian knights against the faceless Muslim hordes. It's more nuanced than that. And so you get these battles played out between them. And so there's a lot of descriptions of this blood and warfare. When I was listening to it, I started listening to it in the car, and my girls wanted to listen to it. So I was listening to it with my oldest two girls, and they listened to it took like 2.5 hours to listen to the whole book. They listened to probably the first 45 minutes or an hour, and they were actually tracking with it pretty well. I was kind of impressed. But when it got to the battle scenes, I was like, you're going to have to read this when you're older, because it's gory, it's violent. They like to describe exactly how everyone dies and what that looks like, and it's very vivid. These are songs that would have been sung to medieval peasants and things. So it has to be kind of, it's an action movie, kind of vibe. And so that's the other layer, is that there's just all these kind of action scenes and battles. Dorothy Sayers, in the introduction to her translation, talks about how it can seem gratuitous to us. We're an age that doesn't have a lot of stomach for that in some ways, and other ways we're very violent. But for the medievals, warfare was not only a way of life and a common thing that they experienced, but the kind of knightly exploits were sort of the main sport as well. So it's kind of like getting the blow by blow, she says, of a sports game or something like that, and that's kind of what the poet is doing there as well. So it works on both of those levels. So there's the interpersonal action, questions about virtue and knightly character. What does it mean to be a noble person? What does chivalry mean? And again, the Song of Roland is being written right as all of that is kind of flowering in the Middle Ages. And then the other side is just, it's an adventure story, it's a knightly tale, it's this epic heroic conflict, and you get to see that kind of played out in that way. So it's a fascinating poem, and one that it has a little bit of everything, right? It has these kind of mythical characters. Charlemagne is presented, even though at the historical battle he was probably in his late 30s. Here he's like 200 years old is how he's presented, and he's white-haired, and angels come and talk to him, and he is presented not as a historical figure in that limited sense, but as a kind of figure who transcends history. He is the paradigmatic, wise, brave, sensitive Christian prince, and so he's a sort of model of that. And so there's all sorts of literary tropes and themes that are very important. And I'll just say one more word about this in terms of the significance of the Song of Roland. It's not only important because of the quality of the poem itself and the themes and characters that it introduces, on its own terms, but it becomes important because these same characters will appear again and again and again in other works, not only in French works. Again, like I said, there's a whole kind of genre, these songs of deeds that focus on Charlemagne and his knights and all of that, so it becomes very important there. But some of the characters like Roland and Oliver end up being brought into like Italian literature, and so Dante will draw in some of these characters, and other writers as well. There's some Spanish epics that are written later that are very much in the vein of the Song of Roland. So if you want to understand the history of Western literature, and if you want to appreciate those connections and allusions, you need to read the Song of Roland at some point. And so it's well worth reading from that vantage point. It is a window into the medieval world. So you see the violence of it, you see the brutality of it, you see the chivalry there, but you see the flawed characters too. One of the things that I think will probably rub modern people the most, and it rubbed me the wrong way. As a Protestant, I could see a lot, it's a window into the medieval world, and you're seeing medieval Christianity. And at times you want to cheer, but at many times you just want to say, wow, you've really got some important things wrong. So for example, um, you see how the cause of Christ is completely intertwined with and indistinguishable from the cause of Charlemagne, and so this political and economic or political and military clash that's taking place is viewed as the triumph of the gospel, even though there's no actual preaching or proclamation of the gospel is taking place. There's no heart changes taking place. It's a kind of brute force as these different nations and cultures clash, and that's something that, as we know, it bears terrible fruit in years to come, and is very different from the ethic and approach of Christ and the apostles in the New Testament, and the example even of the earliest church and how they witnessed to and won the Roman Empire. So there's a lot there. Again, it's good for discussion, right? It'd be a great book to discuss with high schoolers. But you're seeing a very different way of thinking that I think has a lot of problems that we need to critique. As well, theologically, one of the main characters in the battle is this archbishop who is a warrior priest kind of thing, and he's out there blessing the men, and he tells them, if you die today, you will be a martyr, you will go to heaven, you'll be a Christian saint, and he's out there, hacking the heads off of the pagans as he's blessing the people, and it's so far from what it should be, and yet it does give you a picture of the way of thinking and the way of life that was present in the medieval period. So even for those reasons, it's worth reading, but there's a lot there that I think Protestant Christians, modern people would critique and disagree with. One thing that is interesting, at this point, again, early 12th century, Christianity and Islam are coming more and more into contact and into conflict as well. And yet it's amazing to see how little they understood each other. And you get a window into this in the Song of Roland, because they portray the Muslims, they talk about them as pagans, which would be a very standard way of referring to non-Christians of whatever stripe. But they assume that because they're pagans, that means they must be idol worshippers. So like one of the climactic scenes after the Saracens have been defeated, their idols are being destroyed, and they're portrayed as worshiping Muhammad and worshiping Apollo and worshiping Turgamot, I think. So they have this kind of like, the Christians are sort of assuming like, oh, the Muslims must have their own kind of version of the Trinity, these different characters, even though Muslims, of course, are worshiping Allah and, respecting the Prophet Muhammad. I don't believe he's a prophet. I think he's a false prophet. But the understanding that these Western Christians have of Islamic beliefs is actually very sketchy. And Dorothy Sayers points out, in her intro to her translation, if you read Islamic literature from this time period about Christian worship and beliefs, you'll see the same kind of dynamic happening there. They don't really understand each other. They haven't really engaged. Now, again, I'm an evangelical, historically Orthodox Christian. I believe that Christianity and Islam are incompatible. They're different religions. And I believe that Christianity is the one true religion. I think when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, that is absolutely true. So I'm not saying this to diminish that. But of course, it is important as we're engaging with other religions to actually understand what they're teaching so that we can present the truth in a way that is clear and compelling to them. And I do believe that the way God wants us to move the gospel forward is not with the sword, but with faithful witness and preaching. So that's kind of its own point, but it's a point worth making here. Having said that, this is a window into the medieval world, and it gives you a chance to sort of see how that all works. Sorry, one of my daughters had to poke their head in right there. So let me kind of wrap this up. So I do think it's a very important poem from a literary perspective. It's very important in terms of French literature and its influence on Western literature as a whole. It's also just a good poem. And it's quick moving, it's action packed, it's engaging. You've got interesting dynamic characters, and there's a whole set of action that goes on there and discussions and questions that raises. There's just good old fashioned battlefield scenes that are interesting and engaging, and it's a window into the medieval way of thinking about what does it mean to be chivalrous, the role of Christianity or just religion in society and culture, all these kinds of questions. So it's very, very interesting and important. A lot, therefore, because it is a picture of the medieval world that we would want to critique or disagree with, but that's the kind of back and forth and conversation that should happen between ages, and part of the benefit and value of reading these different things. Okay, that was a different daughter who needed something. So this is the joys of trying to work from home and do these things with kids, but it's okay. So I think it's a poem well worth reading. Now, let me just say a much briefer word about translations and the specific production that I listened to, the audiobook version. So translations, the translation I listened to was D.D.R. Owens, as I said. It's the only translation I've ever read in full, so it's the one I'm familiar with. It was good. I appreciated it and enjoyed the translation. Having said that, I was looking up online Dorothy Sayers, because I know that she had done a translation, which is published with Penguin Press now, our publishers, and I was reading her introduction, and that is really great. You can find most of that online and read it, and it's very helpful to kind of frame the characters, the significance, the historical background, all of that. And in that, she quotes from her own translation some, and it's phenomenal. Same thing with her Dante translations. I have read those, and I love those. So I think if I was going to buy an edition, and I probably want to, I'll get the Dorothy Sayers one. So I would recommend, if you're just looking for one, probably get Dorothy Sayers. But there are others available. And the Owens translation was I think fine. I enjoyed it. I got the sense of it, appreciated it. So, but if I had to pick, I'd probably go for Sayers. The production that I listened to was an interesting one. Like I said, they had a full ensemble, a full cast, and they had like sound effects at times with the battle scenes and horses running and things like that. But it was very clunky. Some of the actors, the narrator was great. Some of the actors were really solid. Others were very stilted. It very obviously felt too like everyone had recorded their lines separately and then they kind of spliced them together. So there's no sense that like these guys are acting off of each other in that sense. The sound effects were very clunky. I mean, it sounded like, okay, someone is looking up a horse sound effect and then they insert it there. So I don't know if anyone else will come across that on Hoopla. I listened to it for free, so that it still worked. It didn't take away too much from the poem, but I think I would have preferred just a good narrator narrating the poem to the way that it was performed. Although it would be a poem that would be great to either have a proper audiobook with a full cast ensemble doing, or something to just read. Again, I think this would work really well in like a high school context. It's not that long. You could assign different people to read different parts. That could work. So I wouldn't give the highest stars to the production I listened to. The translation was solid, although Sayers is probably better. But I would definitely recommend, if you have any interest in Western literature, knights and chivalry and epic poems, that you would definitely take some time to read The Song of Roland.